The Condition of Labor by Henry George. Part 2, Land or Slavery. Your Holiness will see from the explanation I have given that the reform we propose, like all true reforms, has both an ethical and an economic side. By ignoring the ethical side and pushing our proposal merely as a reform of taxation, we could avoid the objections that arise from confounding ownership with possession. All that we seek practically is a legal abolition as fast as possible of taxes on the products and processes of labor, and the consequent concentration of taxation on land values, irrespective of improvements. But to those who think as I do, the ethical is the more important side. Not only do we not wish to evade the question of private property and land, but to us it seems that the beneficent and far-reaching revolution we aim at is too great a thing to be accomplished by intelligent self-interest, and can be carried by nothing less than the religious conscience. Hence we earnestly seek the judgment of religion. This is the tribunal of which Your Holiness, as the head of the largest body of Christians, is the most august representative. It therefore behooves us to examine the reasons you urge in support of private property and land, if they be sound, to accept them, and if they be not sound, respectfully to point out to you wherein is their error. To your proposition that our first and most fundamental principle, when we undertake to alleviate the condition of the masses, must be the inviolability of private property, we would joyfully agree if we could only understand you to have in mind rightful private property. Unfortunately, however, other expressions show that you mean private property in general, and have expressly in mind private property in land. This confusion of thought runs through your whole argument, leading you to conclusions so unwarranted by your premises as to be utterly repugnant to them, as when from a moral sanction of private property in the things produced by labor, you infer something entirely different and utterly oppose, a similar right of property in the land created by God. Private property is not of one species, and moral sanction can no more be asserted universally of it than of marriage. That proper marriage conforms to the law of God does not justify the polygamous or incestuous marriages that are in some countries permitted by the civil law. And as there may be immoral marriage, so may there be immoral private property. The mere lawyer, the mere servant of the state, may rest here, refusing to distinguish between what the state holds equally lawful. Your Holiness, however, is not a servant of the state, but a servant of God, a guardian of morals. You know, as said by St. Thomas of Aquin, that human law is law only in virtue of its accordance with right reason, and that insofar as it deviates from right reason, it is called an unjust law. In such case, it is not law at all, but rather a species of violence. Thus, that any species of property is permitted by the state does not of itself give it moral sanction. The state has often made things property that are not justly property, but involve violence and robbery. Slaves were universally treated as property by the customs and laws of the classical nations, and were so acknowledged in Europe long after the acceptance of Christianity. In the United States, a little more than 30 years ago, to buy a man gave the same legal ownership as to buy a horse. Yet Your Holiness, one of the glories of whose pontificate is the attempt to break up slavery in its last strongholds, will not contend that the moral sanction that attaches to property in things produced by labor can or ever could apply to property in slaves. Reading your encyclical as a whole, there can be no doubt of your intention that private property in land shall be understood when you speak merely of private property. With this interpretation, I find that the reasons you urge for private property in land are 8. Let us consider them in order of presentation. First, you urge that what is bought with rightful property is rightful property. Clearly, Purchase and sale cannot give, but can only transfer ownership. Property that in itself has no moral sanction does not obtain moral sanction by passing from seller to buyer. If right reason does not make the slave the property of the slave buyer, it does not make him the property of the slave buyer. Yet your reasoning as to private property in land would as well justify property in slaves. To show this, it is only needful to change in your argument the word land to the word slave. It would then read thus: if a man lives sparingly, saves money, and invests his savings in a slave, the slave in such a case is only his wages in another form, and consequently a working man's slave thus purchased should be as completely at his own disposal as the wages he receives for his labor. Nor, in turning your argument for private property in land into an argument for private property in men, am I doing a new thing. In my own country, in my own time, this very argument that purchase gave ownership was the common defense of slavery. It was made by statesmen, by jurists, by clergymen, by bishops. In language almost identical with yours, it was asked, here is a poor man who has worked hard, lived sparingly, and invested his savings in a few slaves. Would you rob him of his earnings by liberating those slaves? And because of this perversion of reason, this acceptance of man's law as though it were God's law, there came on our nation a judgment of fire and blood. The error of our people in thinking that what in itself was not rightfully property could become rightful property by purchase and sale is the same error into which your holiness falls. Private property in land no less than private property in slaves is a violation of the true rights of property. They are different forms of the same robbery, twin devices by which the perverted ingenuity of man has sought to enable the strong and the cunning to escape God's requirement of labor by forcing it on others. What difference does it make whether I merely own the land on which another man must live or own the man himself? Am I not in the one case as much his master as in the other? Can I not compel him to work for me? Can I not take to myself as much of the fruits of his labor? For to deprive a man of land is as certainly to kill him as to deprive him of blood by opening his veins, or of air by tightening a halter around his neck. The essence of slavery is in empowering one man to obtain the labor of another without recompense. Private property in land is this as fully as chattel slavery. The slave owner must leave to the slave enough of his earnings to enable him to live. Are there not in so-called free countries great bodies of working men who get no more? And when the appropriation of land has gone so far that no free land remains to which the landless man may turn, then, without further violence, the more insidious form of labor robbery involved in private property and land takes the place of chattel slavery, because more economical and convenient. For under it, the slave does not have to be caught or held or to be fed when not needed. He comes of himself, begging the privilege of serving, and when no longer wanted can be discharged. The lash is unnecessary. Hunger is as efficacious. This is why the Norman conquerors of England and the English conquerors of Ireland did not divide up the people, but divided the land. Slavery is not yet abolished, though in all Christian countries its ruder form is now gone. It still exists in the heart of our civilization in more insidious form and is increasing. Yet your encyclical employs in defense of one form of slavery the same fallacies that the apologists for chattel slavery used in defense of the other. Second, you argue that man, possessing reason and forethought, may not only acquire ownership of the fruits of the earth, but also of the earth itself. Reason, with its attendant forethought, is indeed the distinguishing attribute of man. And this gift of reason does, as your holiness points out, involve the need and right of private property in whatever is produced by the exertion of reason. The right of private ownership does therefore indisputably attach to things provided by man's reason and forethought, but it cannot attach to things provided by the reason and forethought of God. To illustrate, let us suppose a company traveling through the desert as the Israelites traveled from Egypt. Such of them as had the forethought to provide themselves with vessels of water would acquire a just right of property in the water so carried. And in the thirst of the waterless desert, those who had neglected to provide themselves, though they might ask water in charity, could not demand it in right. For while water itself is of the providence of God, the presence of this water in such vessels at such place results from the providence of the men who carried it. But suppose others use their forethought in pushing ahead and appropriating the springs, refusing when their fellows come up to let them drink of the water save as they buy it. Would such forethought give any right? Your Holiness, it is not the forethought of carrying water where it is needed, but the forethought of seizing springs that you seek to defend in the private ownership of land. It will be seen, on consideration, that all of man's production is analogous to such transportation of water. In growing grain, or smelting metals, or building houses, or weaving cloth, all that man does is to change in place or form pre-existing matter. As a producer, man is merely a changer, not a creator. God alone creates. But such right of ownership is in reality a mere right of temporary possession. For though man may take material from the storehouse of nature and change it to suit his desires, yet from the moment he takes it, it tends back to that storehouse again. Wood decays, iron rusts, stone disintegrates. Thus, the recognition of the ownership of what natural material is embodied in the products of man never constitutes more than temporary possession, never interferes with the reservoir provided for all. But man cannot so own the earth itself, for that is the reservoir from which must constantly be drawn not only the material with which alone men can produce, but even their very bodies. The conclusive reason why man cannot claim ownership in the earth itself is in the fact stated by you when you truly say, nature owes to man a storehouse that shall never fail the daily supply of his daily wants, and this he finds only in the inexhaustible fertility of the earth. By man you mean all men. By nature you mean God. Can what nature owes to all men be made the private property of some men, from which they may debar all other men? This is the same conclusion carried to its irresistible point by the Bishop of Meath, who says, God was perfectly free in the act by which he created us. But having created us, he bound himself by that act to provide us with the means necessary for our subsistence. The land is the only source of this kind now known to us. The land, therefore, of every country is the common property of the people of that country, because its real owner, the Creator who made it, has transferred it as a voluntary gift to them. Third, you argue that even though divided among private owners, the earth does not cease to minister to the needs of all, since those who do not possess the soil can, by selling their labor, obtain the produce of the land. Suppose that, to your holiness, as a judge of morals, one should put this case of conscience. I am one of several children to whom our father left a field abundant for our support. I, being the eldest, took the whole field in exclusive ownership, but in doing so I have not deprived my brothers of their support, for I have let them work for me on it, paying them from the produce as much wages as I would have had to pay strangers. Is there any reason why my conscience should not be clear? What would be your answer? Would you not tell him that he was in mortal sin, and call on him to make restitution and to do penance? Or suppose that as a temporal prince, your holiness were ruler of a rainless land, such as Egypt, where the want of springs was supplied by a bountiful river like the Nile. Suppose you were told that some of your subjects had set up a claim of ownership in the river, refusing the others a drop of water except as they bought it, and that thus they had become rich without work. while the others, though working hard, were so impoverished by paying for water as to be hardly able to exist. Would not your indignation wax hot when this was told? I do not need more formally to show your holiness that, between utterly depriving a man of God's gifts and depriving him of God's gifts unless he will buy them, is merely the difference between the robber who leaves his victim to die and the robber who puts him to ransom. From your palace of the Vatican, the eye may rest on the expanse of the Campagna. Once that expanse was tilled by thriving husbandmen and dotted with smiling hamlets, what for centuries has condemned it to desertion? It was private property and land, the growth of the great estates of which Pliny saw that ancient Italy was perishing. If you will go to Scotland, you may see great tracts that, under the Gaelic tenure, which recognized the right of each to a foothold in the soil, bred sturdy men, but that now, under the recognition of private property and land, are given up to wild animals. If you go to Ireland, your bishops will show you, on lands where now only beasts graze, the traces of hamlets that, when they were young priests, were filled with honest, kindly, religious people. If you will come to the United States, you will find in a land wide enough and rich enough to support and comfort the whole population of Europe, the growth of a sentiment that looks with evil eye on immigration, because the artificial scarcity that results from private property and land makes it seem as if there is not room enough for those already here. Go wherever you please where the forces loosed by modern invention are beginning to be felt, and you may see that private property and land is the curse denounced by the prophet, that prompts men to lay field to field till they alone dwell in the midst of the earth. To the mere materialist, this is sin and shame. Shall we, to whom this world is God's world, we who hold that man is called to this life only as a prelude to a higher life, shall we defend it? Fourth, you contend that industry expended on land gives a right to ownership of the land, and that the improvement of land creates benefits inseparable from the land itself. This contention, if valid, could only justify the ownership of land by those who expend industry on it. On the contrary, it would justify a gigantic no-rent declaration that would take land from those who now legally own it and turn it over to the tenants and laborers. What you really mean, I take it, is that the original justification of land ownership is in the expenditure of labor on it. But neither can this justify private property and land as it exists. For is it not all but universally true that existing land titles do not come from use, but from force or fraud? Is it not true that the greater part of the land of Italy is held by those who, so far from ever having expended industry on it, have been mere appropriators of the industry of those who have? And if industry give ownership to land, what are the limits of this ownership? If a man may acquire the ownership of several square miles of land by grazing sheep on it, does this give to him and his heirs the ownership of the same land when, by the growth of population, it is needed for the close occupation of a great city? Is it on the rights given by the industry of those who first used it for grazing cows that you would found the title to the land now covered by the city of New York and having a value of thousands of millions of dollars? But your contention is not valid. Industry expended on land gives ownership in the fruits of that industry, but not in the land itself. Just as industry expended on the ocean would give a right of ownership to the fish taken by it, but not a right of ownership in the ocean. Nor is private ownership necessary to secure the fruits of labor on land. That ownership is not necessary is shown by the fact that in all civilized countries, land owned by one person is cultivated and improved by other persons. Nearly the whole of London has been built by those who are not the owners of the ground. If, therefore, the state levy a tax equal to what the land, irrespective of improvement, would bring, it will take the benefits of mere ownership, but will leave the full benefits of use and improvement. Thus, what we propose would secure, as it is impossible in any other way to secure, what you properly say is just and right, that the results of labor should belong to him who has labored. For labor, as the active factor, is the producer of all wealth. Mere ownership produces nothing. A man might own a world, but so sure is the decree that by the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat bread, that without labor he could not get a meal, nor provide himself a garment. Hence, when the owners of land, by virtue of their ownership and without laboring themselves, get the products of labor in abundance, these things must come from the labor of others, taken from those who have a right to them, and enjoyed by those who have no right to them. Fifth, you urge that private property in land has the support of the common opinion of mankind, and that it is sanctioned by divine law. Even were it true that the common opinion of mankind has sanctioned private property in land, this would no more prove its justice than the once universal practice of the known world would have proved the justice of slavery. But it is not true. The first perceptions of mankind have always recognized the equality of right to land. Private property in land as we know it has never grown up anywhere save by usurpation or force. Like slavery, it is the result of war. It comes to us of the modern world from your ancestors, the Romans, whose civilization it corrupted and whose empire it destroyed. As to England, the crown lands were given away to favorites. The church lands were parceled among courtiers by Henry VIII. And by a process extending to our own time, all but a mere fraction of the commons were enclosed by the greater landowners. This is the natural result in a growing community of making land private property. When the possession of land means the gain of unearned wealth, the strong and unscrupulous will secure it. But when, as we propose, economic rent, the unearned increment of wealth, is taken by the state for the use of the community, then land will pass into the hands of users and remain there, since no matter how great its value, its possession will be profitable only to users. Your Holiness intimates that the divine law gives its sanction to the private ownership of land. Quoting from Deuteronomy, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, nor his field, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant." But if this inclusion of the words "nor his field" is to be taken as sanctioning private property in land as it exists today, then with far greater force must the words "his manservant nor his maidservant" be taken to sanction chattel slavery. Nowhere, in fact, throughout the Scriptures, can the slightest justification be found for attaching to land the same right of property that justly attaches to the things produced by labor. 6. You say that a father must provide for his children, and that private property in land is necessary to enable him to do so. With all that your Holiness has to say of the sacredness of the family relation, we are in full accord. But how the obligation of the father to the child can justify private property in land, we cannot see. We do, for a few years, need the providence of our fathers after the flesh. But how small, how transient, how narrow is this need, as compared with our constant need for the providence of Him in whom we live, move, and have our being, our Father who art in heaven. It is to Him, the giver of every good and perfect gift, and not to our fathers after the flesh, that Christ taught us to pray, "Give us this day our daily bread." The duty of fathers to transmit to their children profitable property. What is not possible cannot be a duty. Your Holiness has not considered how mankind really lives from hand to mouth, getting each day its daily bread, how little one generation does or can leave another. The profitable property your Holiness refers to is private property in land. It is land that will yield an income to the owner as owner, and therefore it is possible only for some fathers to leave their children profitable land. What therefore your holiness practically declares is that it is the duty of all fathers to struggle to leave their children what only the few, peculiarly strong, lucky, or unscrupulous, can leave. This anti-Christian doctrine has been long in practice throughout the Christian world. What are its results? Are they not the very evils set forth in your encyclical? Under the regime of private property and land, and in the richest countries, not 5% of fathers are able at their death to leave anything substantial to their children, and probably a large majority do not leave enough to bury them. What your holiness is actually, though of course inadvertently, urging is that earthly fathers should assume the functions of the heavenly Father. It is not the business of one generation to provide the succeeding generation with all that is needful to enable them to keep themselves from want and misery. That is God's business. We no create our children than we create our fathers. The duty of the father to the child, the duty possible to all fathers, is so to nurture and teach it that it shall come to manhood with a sound body, well-developed mind, habits of virtue and industry, and in a state of society that shall give it and all others free access to the bounty of God. And for those who might be crippled or incapacitated or deprived of their natural protectors, the most ample provision could be made out of that great and increasing fund with which God in his law of rent has provided society, not as a matter of niggardly and degrading alms, but as a matter of right. And what today is the result of private property and land in the richest of so-called Christian countries? Is it not that young people fear to marry? That married people fear to have children? That children are driven out of life from sheer want of proper nourishment, or compelled to toil when they ought to be at school or at play? If your holiness will consider these things, we are confident that instead of defending private property and land, you will condemn it with anathema. 7. You say that the private ownership of land stimulates industry, increases wealth, and attaches men to the soil and to their country. The idea is expressed by Arthur Young that the magic of property turns barren sands to gold, springs from the confusion of ownership with possession, that attributes to private property and land what is due to security of the products of labor. The change we propose would give to the user of land far greater security for the fruits of his labor than the present system, and far greater permanence of possession. But I should like your holiness to consider how utterly unnatural is the condition of the masses in the richest and most progressive of Christian countries. How large bodies of them live in habitations in which a rich man would not ask his dog to dwell, how the great majority have no homes from which they are not liable on the slightest misfortune to be evicted. What right, for instance, have the majority of your countrymen in the land of their birth? Can they live in Italy, outside of a prison or a poorhouse, except as they buy the privilege from some of the exclusive owners of Italy? May not what was said centuries ago by Tiberius Gracchus be said today? Men of Rome, you are called the lords of the world, yet have no right to a square foot of its soil. The wild beasts have their dens, but the soldiers of Italy have only water and air. What is true of Italy is true of the civilized world, and is becoming increasingly true. It is the inevitable effect, as civilization progresses, of private property and land. 8, you say that the right to possess private property and land is from nature, not from man. That the state has no right to abolish it, and that to take the value of land ownership and taxation would be unjust and cruel to the private owner. The contention that private property and land is from nature has no other basis than the confounding of ownership with possession. That private property and the products of labor is from nature is clear, for nature gives such things to labor and to labor alone. This right is anterior to the state and superior to its enactments, so that it is a violation of natural right for the state to tax the processes and products of labor. But who will dare trace the individual ownership of land to any grant from the Maker of land? What does nature give to such ownership? How does she in any way recognize it? That which derives its existence from man and passes away like him, man may hold and transfer as the exclusive property of the individual. But how can such individual ownership attach to land which existed before man was, and which continues to exist while the generations of men come and go? The unfailing storehouse that the Creator gives to man for the daily supply of his daily wants. Clearly, the private ownership of land is from the state, not from nature. Thus, not merely can no objection be made on the score of morals when it is proposed that the state shall abolish it altogether, but inasmuch as it is a violation of natural right, an impious violation of the benevolent intention of the Creator, it is a moral duty that the state so abolish it. So far from there being anything unjust in taking the full value of land ownership for the use of the community, the real injustice is in leaving it in private hands, an injustice that amounts to robbery and murder. And when your holiness shall see this, I have no fear that you will listen for one moment to the impudent plea that before the community can take what God intended it to take, the present owners of land shall first be compensated. Where the state takes some land for public uses, it is only just that those whose land is taken should be compensated. But where, by a measure affecting all alike, rent is appropriated for the benefit of all, there can be no claim to compensation. Compensation in such case would be a continuance of the same wrong in another form. Compensated for what? For giving up what has been unjustly taken. We do not seek to spoil the Egyptians. We do not ask that what has been unjustly taken from laborers shall be restored. We are willing that bygones should be bygones, and to leave dead wrongs to bury their dead. We propose to let those who, by the past appropriation of land values, have taken the fruits of labor, to retain what they have thus got. We merely propose that for the future, such robbery of labor shall cease, that for the future, landholders shall pay to the community the rent that to the community is justly due,